Mr. President, early this morning, the Senate voted on the tax bill. I voted against the measure, and as I have said many times, I don't think this is a bill that's going to work for my state or for America. And the House now has one more opportunity. I don't think many people think they're going to change their vote, but I just hope instead of celebrating what happens today, they're going to step back and look at what this really means. I am in a group of people that have long called for tax reform. In fact, 2 weeks before this bill passed, we stood before the public and said we would like to work with the Republicans on a bill to bring the business rate down and to bring the money in from overseas, but a bill that didn't add this kind of weight to the debt, and a bill that actually was good for all Americans, not just some Americans. We also could have done so much more. We're adding $1.5 trillion to the debt, yet we are doing nothing for infrastructure. We didn't change the carried interest loophole. We did nothing to fix so many of things that even the president had identified as things that needed to be fixed in the tax code. I've been concerned by this latest effort, which has not been bipartisan at all. It has resulted in a bill that will, as I said, add to the debt, create huge new loopholes, and will encourage companies to move money around and move jobs overseas to avoid taxes. It will have huge unintended consequences on the economy. Why? We didn't even have a hearing over this bill, a bill that will affect every single American. Over the next 10 years, and this is not disputed, this bill will add $1.5 trillion to our national debt. And even the most generous estimate says that we may add $500 billion in economic gain. If that's true, this bill would still be adding $1 trillion to the debt. And by the way, it's not the wealthiest Americans that are going to have to worry about that debt. It is the kids of middle-class Americans, of people that go to work every single day. And what do they go to work to do now? To have a big chunk of their money that's going to pay for this interest on this debt. Almost all economists agree that a deficit-financed tax cut at this point in the business cycle makes no sense at all. If anything, at this time of low unemployment and strong market performance, it gives us a rare opportunity to try to, one, do something about our debt, and two, while we're doing something about our debt, figure out what our priorities are for investment. I would say one of those top priorities is infrastructure, including broadband, including rural broadband. That wasn't in this bill. We accumulated $1.5 trillion in debt. Adding to the debt will, of course, put pressure on programs that everyday Americans rely on. This means Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. One of the most troubling developments in this bill was the inclusion of a provision to repeal a key part of the Affordable Care Act that would kick 13 million people off their insurance by 2027 and increase premiums by 10% in the individual market. And that means less money in the pockets of American middle-class families. The American people want us to work forward together to make fixes to the Affordable Care Act, like the Murray-Alexander bill. But instead, this bill moves us backwards with a partisan approach that kicks people off their health care. This bill, in the end, is really a bait and switch. Millions of middle-class Americans will end up paying more in taxes in the long run, since many of the tax cuts that they receive, if they receive a tax cut at all, would only be temporary. In 10 years, most Americans earning $75,000 or less will pay more in taxes, while people earning more than $100,000 a year will continue to pay less. According to the analysis by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, 644,000 people in my state with incomes below $153,800 would see a tax hike in 2027. Meanwhile, a huge majority of the tax cuts in 2027 and after will benefit only the top 1% of Americans. The bill creates a new and complicated system of taxing the income of companies, especially with regard to their international income. The practical effect of this systemic change is entirely untested. While the bill seeks to impose a minimum tax on overseas earnings, it allows companies to blend the tax rate for income overseas. This seemingly minor detail opens a big loophole that can give companies incentives to move jobs to foreign countries and may create a whole new tax avoidance scheme. While I heard celebration in this chamber last night, I can tell you who are really celebrating: the tax accountants, the lawyers, as people are going to pay them millions and millions of dollars to look for new loopholes in a scheme that, again, didn't even get a hearing. I support bringing down the rate on foreign earnings held overseas, and to make sure that the money, though, is invested here and invested in infrastructure. Bob Posen, the former chairman of the oldest mutual fund company in the United States, has said that the new system in this bill, which includes a new minimum U.S. tax, is like Swiss cheese. It has so many holes that it would rarely be paid by U.S. firms. He goes on to say that, in fact, this proposal would encourage U.S. companies to relocate to foreign countries more of their U.S. factories and U.S. intellectual property, such as patents and trademarks. A minimum tax would be effective only if it applied to the foreign taxes paid by U.S. companies on a country-by-country basis rather than on an aggregate basis across all foreign countries. Again, we haven't had one hearing to understand the impact of this bill. This bill would allow a one-time opportunity to bring back some of the trillions of dollars of earnings overseas. Again, I've long supported this. But I would also like to see at least part of this money be used on infrastructure. That was our original plan. Our original plan was that we were going to create incentives to bring the money in from overseas, bipartisan plan, and then put a chunk of it, if the money was voluntarily brought back, into infrastructure. Why? Well, the American Society of Civil Engineers 2017 report card gave our nation's infrastructure an overall D+ grade. There's an economic imperative to fixing our infrastructure. The future of our markets are exporting to the 90% of those that live outside of our shores. Yet this bill, with accumulating $1.5 trillion in debt, doesn't put the money into the infrastructure that will allow us to have that kind of an export economy. True comprehensive tax reform requires closing loopholes. Yet this bill does almost nothing to close the worst loopholes in our current tax code. The carried interest loophole that President Trump promised over and over again that he would close, still there. The loopholes that benefit big oil, still there. The buffer rule that would make sure the wealthiest Americans pay the same tax as their employees, nowhere to be found. I've already mentioned the new opportunities for tax avoidance created by the new system of international taxation. That's just one of them. This bill contains vast new loopholes for hedge fund managers, real estate investment companies, and anyone who can take a few minutes to reorganize as a pass-through business to take advantage of a lower rate, if you have the money to pay for a lawyer or pay for an accountant to do it. By taxing wage and salary income at a higher rate than so-called pass-through income, this bill creates opportunities for tax avoidance that are virtually unprecedented. Given the speed with which this bill was rushed through, enterprising attorneys and accountants are going to find dozens of new loopholes in the coming years. If done right, we could have closed loopholes. We could have brought back money U.S. companies are holding overseas to fund infrastructure projects here at home. We could have given local businesses the ability to compete against out-of-state internet retailers, support our rural communities, and provide incentives to keep jobs in America. I've always wanted to bring that corporate tax rate down. I have so many successful businesses in my state, but not like this. Not with $1.5 trillion in debt that's going to be put on the people that I represent in my state that just go to work every day. They don't have holdings overseas. They don't have a hedge fund manager. They don't have people that are investing money in all kinds of ventures all over the world, they just go to work and get an hourly wage. Or maybe they get a salary, and they just get enough money so that they hope that they can have a house and send their kids to college. This bill, it doesn't make it easier on them. It does not simplify the tax code. If anything, it makes it more complicated. It does not close loopholes. It's a huge missed opportunity. A few weeks ago, I joined 17 of my Democratic colleagues in calling on our Republican colleagues to join us in a bipartisan approach to tax reform. Unfortunately, the bill that we voted on early this morning and the bill that the House still has an opportunity to look at once more only involve negotiations on one side of the aisle. When that happens, bad things happen, and we can do better. I will continue to work across the aisle on bipartisan solutions. We have to make changes to this bill going forward. We know that, and the American people will depend on it. Madam President, I yield the floor